Levi Bellfield was born into a Romany gypsy family in Isleworth, West London on the 17th of May 1968. He was one of 5 children. Aged 10, Bellfield lost his father to leukemia, and as a result, he formed a very close bond with his mother.
Bellfield was very much a mother's boy, much beloved of his mother. It was a close-knit family, brought up in West London, in what was effectively once a huge community of travellers, and was groomed to thinking from the very early days that he was very special, that there was something particular about him. His mother encouraged him in that view.
I think during his childhood he was a bit of a tearaway. He was a young lad who wanted to do what he wanted to do and not much stood in his way. So he was often kind of larking around and getting into a bit of trouble at school, but nothing completely out of the ordinary.
By the time Bellfield was 13, he'd had his first brush with the law and was arrested for burglary in 1981. It would not be the last time he was in trouble with the police.
I believe Bellfield occupied what you might describe as the halo of Levi Bellfield. I am greater than anything. He was above the law, above suspicion, operated entirely under his own steam, in his own way, at his own time.
In 1989, 21-year-old Bellfield set up home with a girlfriend. They went on to have 4 children together.
He could literally charm the birds off the trees. This is a 19.5, 20-stone man with a huge neck, almost occupying his entire shoulders. He wasn't an attractive man, but my goodness me, he had the gift of the gab, and he didn't half use it to his advantage, particularly when it came to girls.
On March the 21st, 2002, 13-year-old schoolgirl Amanda Dowler, known affectionately as Millie, went missing from her home. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers that day very well.
She was on her way home. She got off the train, was going to walk the half-mile or so back to her home. She was in her school uniform, very identifiable. This was daylight, busy time of the afternoon, lots of people around, but nobody saw anything.
Millie had phoned her father to say she was heading home, but never arrived.
She seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was CCTV footage of her getting off the train at Walton Station. Some very blurred images of cars and the odd person in the street where she was headed home, but nothing more than that. And it became clear very early on that police were really struggling to find what had happened to her.
The last sighting of Millie Dowler was on Station Avenue in Walton, just 50 yards from the home of Levi Bellfield.
The search has taken in stretches of water, including the River Mole, but police have been concentrating on ground near the busy station and interviewing commuters.
We have nothing that gives us any positive indication that she's gone off of her own volition. Equally, we have no positive information that she has been taken off the street and abducted. At this time, all of our lines of inquiry are open.
On September the 18th, 2002, 6 months after her disappearance, the body of Millie Dowler was found by a group of foragers amongst the trees of Yateley Heath Wood in Hampshire.
So Millie was identified through dental records. She was known to be missing. Dental records were obtained, and then they were compared to the remains that were present, and sadly for her family, it confirmed that that's who it was.
It was clear to forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire that Millie's body had been in the woods ever since she disappeared.
I was able to tell the police how long each bone had been there and how long ago it had been moved, because the bones were moved around by animals, you see. There was no doubt in my mind, really, that she had been there since the early spring.
How Millie was killed remained a mystery.
The degree of change that the body goes through after death, particularly in the sort of timescales we're talking about with Millie Dowler, really hinders what the pathologist can see, what the pathologist can say. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can see or say, but clearly the less we have to work with, the more difficult it is.
One likes to be objective, one likes not to think of the remains as a person, one likes to just look for the evidence and you try to be objective. And then, of course, they take you into a scenario where you become fairly emotional. Well, you can't help it. It's an emotional sort of scenario. And then it comes a bit of a shock, really.
The police had no suspects and no forensic evidence. And just 5 months after the discovery of Millie Dowler's body, only a few miles from Walton-on-Thames, another young woman was murdered. At around midnight on the 3rd of February 2003 in Kingston, London, 19-year-old Marcia MacDonald caught the bus home after a night out at the cinema with friends. It was the last time they would ever see her. Walking home, Marcia was attacked from behind less than 100 yards from her parents' front door. Colin Sutton was one of the lead detectives with the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Well, Marcia was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. Local resident heard a noise, heard a whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. Marcia was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement.
Forensic evidence suggested the weapon used was most likely a hammer.
Hammers are effective striking tools, so it's no great surprise that you can cause very severe damage to a human skull with relatively little effort with an effective hammer. You'll often see lacerations, they're often curved to match the profile of the hammer, and you'll often see skull fractures. They're quite often depressed, so pushed inwards towards the brain, because the hammer is exerting its force so focally.
Nightfall and detectives in Hampton still work on, but though they've searched tirelessly all day, they remain baffled as to who carried out this apparently random attack.
Often these things happen and are carried out by somebody the victim knows. In this case, I'm sure police looked at boyfriends, family members, but very quickly ruled out any kind of suspect like that. So it soon became obvious that this was a stranger murder, and those are very rare. So very soon, very quickly after Marcia's murder, people in the area became very concerned that there was a killer on the loose.
Subsequent investigations led police to a mentally unstable 16-year-old who wasn't competent enough to be charged or even interrogated about the incident.
And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution compulsorily. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed, and you know, we've solved that, if you like.
But then investigators noticed a possible link to similar attacks that had happened in the area in the months before.
There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head, and it was only then when Marcia was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that that could have been an assault as well. And they went back to this girl who'd been treated in hospital and were able to talk to hospital staff and look at the description of her wounds and some photographs and conclude that the likelihood was that she too had been attacked but had survived. We found a couple of other offences as well. Again, young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head, and in both these cases they'd survived.
However, none of these other victims were able to identify the attacker.
They just, said I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it.
All of the attacks seemed to be totally unprovoked. Could they all have been committed by the same perpetrator, the man who murdered Marcia McDonnell? By joining the dots, Colin and his team could link Bellfield to another vehicle, the car that ran Kate Sheedy down.
And one of the times that he was arrested was in May 2004, when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And nothing happened about it, and the landlord in the end said, oh no, it was just a prank that went wrong, don't worry about it. Didn't want to press charges, no charges were brought. But the crucial thing was that that arrest took place, and that abduction took place indeed, in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. Kate Sheedy had been attacked in Isleworth, not by being hit across the head, but by being run over by a large vehicle. And she said that this vehicle was something like a Ford Galaxy. Of course, that's exactly what a Toyota Previa is.
The white people carrier, that was actually on my drive about 2 weeks before he ran Kate Sheedy over with it. Only because he asked me if he could leave it there for a couple of nights, and I begrudgingly said yes.
And he got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in, and I remember her saying to me, Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot, and said it was white. We now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Amélie Delagrange was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over.
Bellfield was now the prime suspect. At dawn on the 22nd of November 2004, police raided his West Drayton home.
In the attic is a naked Levi Bellfield. He'd covered himself up in the hope that no one would find him. Well, they did.
Born in Excel on the 6th of November 1956, Marc Dutroux was the oldest of 5 children.
His parents were teachers and at one point emigrated to the Belgian Congo, where they taught. But when the crisis erupted in that country, they brought Dutroux back to Belgium in 1960.
His parents eventually separated in 1971, and 15-year-old Dutroux stayed with his mother.
We know that his mother was incredibly dominant, his father was very aggressive, so I think it was quite a hostile environment to grow up in. And I think those attachments, or lack of attachments with his parents in those early years, did play quite a role in the person he became.
Trained as an electrician but often unemployed, Dutroux soon began a long criminal history, including convictions for car theft, mugging and drug dealing.
Dutroux had a lot of contact with the police. He stepped up from car theft into a rather grand form of car theft, which involved shipping quite expensive luxury cars, which he'd stolen in Belgium, out of the country into Czechoslovakia and Hungary.
The profit from his crimes led to Dutroux owning 7 properties in and around the city of Charleroi, 45 miles south of Brussels. By 1983, 26-year-old Dutroux was married with 2 children, but he'd begun an affair with a schoolteacher called Michel Martin. The 23-year-old would eventually become Dutroux's partner in life and crime, with whom he also had 3 more children. The severity of Dutroux's crimes escalated from theft to sexual assault, and in 1989 he was found guilty of the abduction and rape of 5 young girls, one of whom was just 11 years old.
Marc Dutroux was a predator who selected his prey very carefully. He wanted to choose people who were easy to target in the first place, easy to abduct, but also easy to manipulate once he had them under his control. So he would go for the most vulnerable victims that he could find that fulfilled his desires.
Dutroux's now wife Michelle was found to be complicit in the abductions and served 2 years of a 5-year sentence.
The psychiatrists suggest that Martin and Dutroux, husband and wife, are a classic example of folie à deux, that one egged the other on, and that therefore the sum of the 2 of them was even more dangerous than one alone.
I think when we look at the relationship between Dutroux and his wife, who was implicated in many of his crimes, it is quite interesting. It's quite possible that some people see her as just another one of his victims, somebody else who was manipulated and coerced by him. And when we look at Marc Dutroux and his behaviour, he is incredibly charming at times, and he can be very persuasive. So it wouldn't surprise me if he'd set out with the intention of recruiting somebody to help him in his crimes, and this is somebody who fell for his charms and went along with it.
In December 1995, Dutroux was arrested in relation to a car theft. He was convicted and served almost 4 months in prison. During this time, the police searched his Marcinelle home. They were agonizingly close to finding out Dutroux's darkest secret.
Twice in December 1995, on the 13th and the 19th, police searched the house in Charleroi. One of the most poignant and tragic parts of that search, which included a search of the basement, was that the police failed to identify the dungeon. Even more horrifying, the 2 policemen who searched the house were accompanied by a locksmith who would help them. The locksmith told the policeman that he heard screams. The policeman said, "Oh, it must be from outside," and disregarded him. The terrible truth is that it was from the 2 8-year-olds hidden in this cell, this dungeon.
At Dutroux's house, officers had also found several VHS cassette tapes, but investigators didn't watch them until much later.
It was a home video made by Marc Dutroux, where he was filming the developments in the works in his child cage. This was essential proof that they were on the right track. But for some strange reason, they did this house search, and they didn't exploit the information they got from it.
The police mistakes came at a fatal cost. By the time Dutroux arrived back home after his release from prison in March 1996, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo were dead. Dutroux, his wife Michelle Martin, and an accomplice, Michel Lelièvre, were taken in for questioning. Over several hours of interrogations, all 3 maintained their innocence.
He was consistent in his lies, following each lie by telling another lie. It was a manipulative behavior. But otherwise, he stayed very, very calm.
Belgian authorities had no choice but to eventually release Lelièvre, who denied being with Dutroux on the day Laetitia was kidnapped. But moments after he left the police station in Charleroi, a startling witness account came through.
The neighbours of his property in Marcinelle saw Marc Dutroux and Lelièvre return on Friday evening carrying a child covered by a blanket as they returned to his house, to Dutroux's house.
Lelièvre was immediately rearrested and taken back into custody. As his accomplice's alibi began to crumble, Dutroux's interrogation took a drastic turn.
Dutroux knows that we had proof that Laetitia was in the car, so he says, "Yes, I was in Beatrice," which he denied at the start. "I met a young girl, I talked with her, and then she told me she was tired of her parents." Stories, because there are parts against him and he changes the stories to suit his narrative on the spot. Then, at the same time, Lelièvre said she was with Dutroux, and finally on Thursday, he ends up telling us, "Now that all of these parts of the story contradict each other, I will give you the 2 girls."
Qu'ils le contredisent. Dit, je vais vous donner 2 filles.
Dutroux pointed to a poster inside the interrogation room of another missing girl, Sabine Dardenne. 12-year-old Sabine had been kidnapped by him in May.
2 days after his arrest, Dutroux confessed and took the police to the basement where Sabine and Letitia were found alive.
On the 15th of August 1996, Dutroux led the investigators to his property in Marcinelle, where hidden behind a false wall in the basement was the dungeon where he'd been keeping Sabine Dardenne and Letitia Delhay locked up.
He pulled down the wardrobe, and inside the cage behind was Sabine and Letitia.
And then we got this, at that moment, incredible news that 2 kidnapped girls had been found alive in the cage of a person who had been convicted before for this kind of crimes.
It was such a huge thing. All the journalists were on the scene at the time. The news, magazines were there. It is as if there had been a terrorist attack. No one could believe that such a person could exist in Belgium. It was unthinkable.
C'était pas imaginable.
Laetitia, un sourire, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Ne vous inquiétez pas, je vais bien. Merci de m'avoir aidé. Merci beaucoup.
Douglas de Koninck was one of the few journalists who was allowed to enter Dutroux's basement.
We had seen pictures, we had seen images, but being there is difficult to describe because it's like constructed to you wouldn't even put a dog in such a small place. This was really the kind of cage they made to hide guns from the police.
As Belgium awoke in shock to the news that a man from Marcinelle had abducted, raped and tortured 2 girls over several months, the families of Sabine Dardenne and Letitia Delhay rejoiced that their daughters had been found alive.
They are rare occasions when we find the relatives and a policeman or a magistrate has the opportunity to return a child who have been kidnapped in such circumstances alive. It's fantastic, obviously. It is a joy that can be shared with the parents.
Over the next 48 hours, investigators continued to relentlessly question Dutroux. They were desperate to find the 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, who'd been missing for more than a year.
Marc Dutroux was playing a game with his investigators. He knew that he never would get out of prison anymore. He knew that he would be presented as the most famous criminal we've ever had in Belgium. And he wanted to exploit that situation.
He had to be flattered. They had to make him believe that they believed his pitiful story, make him believe that things were not that bad for him. It's true that you were ingenious on this one. You were not caught, and you fooled the police, and here and there. At that point, his ego had been flattered, and little by little he let information slip. That's his attitude.
After 48 hours of this cat-and-mouse game, Marc Dutroux finally revealed to investigators that he had abducted the 2 8-year-old girls. This killer's story begins in 1946. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on the 24th of November at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont.
This was the 1940s in America. The ideal nuclear family was mum and dad who were married, that nice family unit where everything is very neat and very defined. And people who were outside of that ideal really were stigmatized.
To avoid that judgment, Ted's 22-year-old mother, Eleanor, moved back to her parents' home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where her parents brought up Ted as their own.
The unusual part of his childhood is how he's raised. He's adopted by his grandparents. He's raised alongside a person who he is told is his sister.
But she wasn't. She was actually his mother.
This arrangement went on for almost 4 years, with Ted's grandparents as his main carers.
His grandfather was quite a violent character, so that suggests to me that very early on in his life, he's almost in a bit of a survival mode. I'm not safe within this home.
Just before his 4th birthday, Eleanor moved to Tacoma, Washington. There she met and married Johnny Bundy in 1951. They formally adopted Ted when he was 5 years old. The couple had 4 children together, but Ted reportedly didn't form a close bond with his new family and still believed his mother was his sister.
Ted Bundy is somebody who has always been really conscious of his social class. He came from quite humble beginnings, that the family were quite poor, and he was really quite aware of that and really quite embarrassed and ashamed by it.
An exceptionally bright student, Ted Bundy enrolled in the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. There, aged 20, he met and fell in love with a woman called Stephanie.
This was his dream girl. This was the woman he was going to marry. This is the woman to which he was dedicated. It was romance in the realest sense that you could imagine it.
But she suddenly dumped him.
One of the reasons that she cited was that he wasn't ambitious enough. And I think this would have really hit Ted Bundy quite hard, because this feeds into his anxieties around his social class and those feelings of unease and those feelings of not being good enough. So what we've got happening here is this resentment brewing.
Bundy dropped out of university in 1968. The following year, he returned to the East Coast in what he later described as a bid to understand his roots. Whilst there, Bundy unearthed a family secret.
He discovers his true identity. He discovers that the woman that he's considered to be his sister for his whole life is actually his mother. And he discovers his birth certificate, and the birth certificate says he's illegitimate.
The 2 most important women to him, his mother and his mother's surrogate, and the woman he wanted to marry, in essence, both deny and abandon him. The significance to him of that is that women simply cannot be trusted.
She was at home asleep in her house one night when Ted Bundy broke in, and he beat her with a metal pole and he raped her, and she was in a really terrible state. Many people think this is something that just kind of came out of the blue, but I would say absolutely not, it didn't. I think this was an attack that was built up to. We often find with offenders there's some behaviour before they get to the point of raping and attacking people. And in Ted Bundy's case, this was voyeurism. So he had a history of peeping through women's windows and watching them get undressed. It's something that gradually builds, and it's not enough for him, and he ratchets it up to the next level.
The violent assault left the young woman unconscious for 10 days.
She sustained injuries from the blows to the head. That will cause brain damage and brain swelling. And when he sexually assaulted her with a metal bar, that caused damage to her internal organs, and she was left permanently altered by those injuries.
Seattle, Washington, February 1974. It was here that 27-year-old Ted Bundy attacked again and turned from rapist to killer.
It's no coincidence that she's a university student who he sees as privileged, who he sees as undeserving, whereas he's somebody who's really hard done by. And it is that constant jealousy, that constant underlying feeling of shame that drives a lot of his violence.
Bundy's chosen target was a 21-year-old University of Washington student called Linda. He broke into her room.
He very severely attacks her. He really does bash her skull when he carries out the assault on her. She doesn't survive the attack.
That night, after he'd attacked and killed Linda, Bundy moved her away from the campus. He dumped her body in the dense woods of Taylor Mountain Forest, a 30-minute drive from the university.
It's very important that he maintains control over the victims, even after he's killed them. So he doesn't just leave them where they are. He wants to be able to know where they are. He wants to have control over them. So he chooses a local beauty spot, Taylor Mountain. It's a place that people generally go to enjoy. But for him, it really is a macabre dump site.
Linda's body was found a year later in 1975. Her death marked the start of a furious spate of killings. At this time, Bundy quit law school in Tacoma after just 6 months. He returned to Washington, not as a student, but as a predator.
He would lure women over to his car, saying that he needed their assistance with something. And he'd often be wearing a sling to make it appear that he'd injured himself. And he was good-looking, he was charming, he was respectable.
Bundy's trademark VW Beetle became his favourite method for abducting women before taking them to a remote spot to attack them.
When he hit, it was like a shark grabbing its prey. Bam!
He'd use a blunt object to bludgeon his victims, and then he'd strangle them.
After 8 aggravated murders of young women in the first half of 1974, a rate of more than 1 a month, fear spread across the Pacific Northwest.
I think Ted Bundy enjoys the feelings of power. He enjoys the feelings of control. So you start to see the attacks get closer together because he's having to escalate his offending to get that same feeling of power. We know with psychopaths like Ted Bundy, they're prone to boredom, so they will start to mix it up a bit and offend in different ways.
Then in the summer of that year, Bundy changed his MO. He now decided to attack in broad daylight. On July the 14th at Lake Sammamish State Park, just over 15 miles southeast of the University of Washington, Bundy attacked 2 young women, 23-year-old Janice and 19-year-old Denise. Denise was last seen entering a public restroom in the park.
There are some witnesses to these crimes, and there's one common denominator, and that seems to be a man called Ted who drives a VW Beetle. So that begins to narrow the field a little.
Bundy later said that he kidnapped both women from the state park within a few hours of each other. He raped them and made one watch as he murdered the other. Around 2:45 a.m. on January the 15th, 1978, Ted Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house.
He's somebody who's familiar with college towns, with college buildings. So I think he knew that there were many women in this house, and that was his intention all along.
Within 15 minutes, he had attacked 4 women, brutally, cracking their skulls, breaking their collarbones.
21-year-old Margaret was hit with a piece of firewood and then strangled to death with her stockings. 20-year-old Lisa was beaten unconscious, raped and killed.
The attack is incredibly brutal. There's rape, he beats people, he knocks people's teeth out, he bites the buttock of one of the victims.
The magnitude of the terror for the victim is as intense as the magnitude of the rage by the perpetrator.
2 others were both severely beaten and assaulted. Miraculously, they survived. Within the hour, the sheriff of Leon County, Ken Katsaris, was called to the crime scene.
When I got there, I did check with the investigators. They had secured the scene. We knew that we had 2 who were obviously dead, and 2 that they believed may die. You could tell which one was first. You could tell which one was second, third, and fourth. But you could tell how much energy that he expended.
This was not the end of Bundy's activity that night.
As I'm standing outside of the sorority house, we get a call that there's strange noises coming from a condo next door. And I sent an investigator immediately because I said, 6 blocks away, could it be? He's doing it again, which only tells you he couldn't help himself.
Bundy had broken into another apartment where he savagely beat another student.
She was in a pool of blood when my investigator went in the condo or the apartment, and Bundy was leaving out the back window, but she tended to the injured first.
Still free a few weeks later, Bundy struck again, this time in Lake City in northern Florida. His victim was another little girl who was just 12 years old.
He is a prolific serial killer at this point in time. Serial killing is his hobby, it's his vocation, it's something that he feels that he's good at, and more so, he's getting away with it. And when somebody's getting away with it, they're certainly not going to stop. And if anything, their offending is only going to get worse.
Bundy dumped the girl's brutalized body in woods about 30 miles west of Lake City. He then stole a car and made his way west into the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, on February the 15th, 1978, an alert Pensacola police officer stopped America's most notorious serial killer near the Alabama state line for driving suspiciously.
He just had a gut feeling that something might be wrong. And of course, it came out over his radio after he called it in that the vehicle had been stolen.
After a brief struggle in which the officer was forced to fire a warning shot, Bundy was arrested. He was taken to the Leon County Jail in Tallahassee, Florida.
Sexual assault and murder of innocents, just wee girls, is particularly horrific.
Black was finally arrested in 1990 after trying to snatch a young girl in broad daylight. He was eventually convicted of 4 child murders between 1981 and 1986. His youngest victim was only 5 years old.
I think the impact of the Robert Black case on the community and on the nation was pretty devastating. This was the end of the idea of the innocence of childhood. After the Black case, I think parents started putting more restrictions on their children's freedom.
Pat Cardy's 9-year-old daughter Jennifer was abducted and murdered by Black in 1981. But it would take several years before she knew who was responsible for killing her daughter.
We still miss her, particularly our 2 boys. When she was taken, how hard, how difficult, how heavy it was upon them, not understanding anything, but just knowing that she would never be there again. That was brutal.
Journalist Tim Tate investigated Black's life in the hope of discovering why he did what he did.
They were terrible crimes. He probably killed more children than any other convicted child sex serial killer in Britain.
This killer's story begins in 1947. Robert Black was born on the 21st of April in Grangemouth, about 20 miles from Edinburgh, Scotland.
Robert Black's mother was unmarried at the time. There was a real stigma around illegitimacy, so he was given up. Now, his mother went on to get married and to have 4 other children, but she never ever wanted anything to do with Robert Black. So right from the outset, this is somebody who's facing rejection and exclusion. He's somebody who has come into the world with a stigma on him.
Black was fostered by Jack and Margaret Tulip, who lived in a remote western Scottish village.
They were in their mid-50s. They had no previous experience. They were strict. They were God-fearing, and he's never given their name. He's always Robert Black, something that would have marked him out at the time in that small community.
Black later alleged that his foster parents were abusive towards him.
The foster father died when he was 5, but the foster mother continued the abusive behaviour that had been perpetrated beforehand. So he was beaten when he wet the bed. Here is somebody who does not have a safe or a secure home environment. This is a young boy who has got no comfort from anybody whatsoever.
From this disturbed upbringing, Black unsurprisingly rebelled and developed an unhealthy interest in other children.
By the age of 8, he started offending. He's already developed sexualized behavior. He's taking the time and the trouble to peer up little girls' skirts. He has molested, that's putting it gently, a baby. And he's begun to explore bodily orifices. This is the obsession that will be with him all his life.
In 1958, Black's foster mother died, and he was sent to a children's home near Falkirk. His fascination with sex continued, and along with some other boys in the house, he tried to rape a 12-year-old girl.
I think that act, if you like, was the genesis of Black's paedophilia.
At some point, almost every pedophile who's attracted to a very young girl
was always on the lookout for his next victim. And he had in the back of his van what can only be described as an abduction kit. He had bindings, he had this sack which he would put the child in.
On the 30th of July 1982, Black was on a delivery job in Northumberland, northeast England, near to the village of Coldstream, where a young schoolgirl was leaving her house to go and play with her friends.
Susan Maxwell is 11. She lives with her mum and her stepdad and their children in a little village. It's a happy, warm, loving home. It's a summer. It's afternoon. Susan says she wants to go and play tennis with her friend, and it's agreed that Susan will walk home.
The tragic irony is that she encounters none other than Robert Black and his van.
She had begun walking home, and at some point after 4:30, which is the last time anyone saw her, she was snatched, literally snatched, put in the back of Black's van and driven away.
Susan's mother had changed her mind about letting Susan walk home and decided to pick her daughter up, but there was no sign of her anywhere, and she called the police. Tom Wood was the detective inspector at the Lothian and Borders Serious Crime Squad.
We were sent down to the borders straight away to help with the investigation, and there were huge searches made off the area because we thought that she might have been thrown over the bridge or fallen over the bridge or might have come to harm locally.
On the 12th of August, a body was found near a village in a lay-by in the West Midlands, over 200 miles from where Susan had been abducted.
It was the middle of the summer, and so the body was badly decomposed to the extent it was some time before we discovered that it was actually Susan.
That made it impossible for the coroner to determine an exact cause of death.
Susan was found partially clothed, indicating that she'd been sexually assaulted. The police were desperate to find the person responsible for such a heinous act.
Most people are murdered by someone close to them. So we had to be very, very careful that we didn't go off in flights of fancy and that we did our homework first. Who was with her? When was she last seen? We then looked at local offenders. Were there any young men around who were committing sexual offences? And then we started on the big investigations looking for vehicles that were seen in the vicinity. And we got absolutely nowhere with it whatsoever.
Well, Black avoided capture of characteristics that was physical, that had to do with his fixation. And that second criteria was that no adults had to be near that child or nearby responsible for taking care of that child.
He would rehearse, he would drive round and round, even if he saw a child who he thought matched his image of an ideal victim. He wouldn't abduct straight away. He would monitor, he would look for escape routes, and only when everything was perfect would he pounce.
For Robert Black, these girls were essentially disposable objects. He would abduct them in these blitz attacks off the streets. He'd abuse them, and then he would just discard them. He really was the most remorseless offender.
Robert Black had now killed 4 young girls in just over 4.5 years. His appetite for abducting, abusing, and murdering young children would only intensify. The police had connected the murders of 3 of the young victims, but they were no closer to catching the killer. But a chance encounter would soon change everything.
In July 1990, Black is still driving his van. And this time he returns to the borders of Scotland, a little town called Stow. A retired post office worker is mowing his lawn when he sees a van pull up. He also sees a young girl walk past the van, and then he sees the young girl lifted up and whisked into the van.
With great presence of mind, this guy noted the number of this van accurately and immediately phoned the police. The police attended, and as they were standing discussing the issue on this little road in Stow.
Black drives back down the same road where the same post office worker shouts, "That's the van!" And it is the same van, and it is Black driving it.
A policeman stepped out, stopped the van, then detained the driver, and then searched the van. First found nothing, and then found the wee girl lying in the bottom of the van in a bag, semi-suffocated.
And the man who opens the back doors of the van is the little girl's father, who's a policeman. Can you imagine what impact that must have had on him? There can be no doubt that it was Black's overconfidence, his arrogance, to do something so outrageous in broad daylight in a tiny Scottish town, and what's more then to drive back down the same road in which he's abducted.
And thankfully, the little girl is still alive. She's been sexually assaulted, but she's escaped with her life.
It's important to understand that a serial killer of the kind that Black was, he was an obsessed serial killer, not an incidental serial killer. He was destined to kill over and over and over again. Had he not been caught that day, that girl would have died and many others would have died.
Now, immediately Robert Black was arrested for that. Literally within the hour, we knew this was the man we were looking for, because the modus operandi was so identical.
On the 10th of August 1990, Black pleaded guilty to the abduction and sexual abuse of the 6-year-old girl in Stow. He was given a life sentence and was sent to Sawton Prison in Edinburgh. This killer's story begins in 1949. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January the 31st, the first of 2 sons. He was raised in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, in a strict Catholic household.
His father worked at the Ford Motor Company. His mother was a homemaker, so they were very much the traditional American nuclear family.
Berdella was a shy, intelligent child who struggled to fit in at school.
He was bullied by his peers because he did stand out as different. He wore very thick glasses. He went to the algebra club. He collected stamps. So there was that sense in which he always felt that isolation from his peer group.
Then, in his mid-teens, his world was turned upside down.
Berdella's father died of a heart attack when he was 16, and this did have quite a significant impact on him because his mother remarried and she went on to set up another home with somebody else. And I think that Berdella really did feel a sense of rejection here. He was part of his mother's past. The world had moved on and he was left behind.
Around the same time, Berdella had been working part-time.
There's a particular incident that Berdella later recalls that is potentially significant. Berdella claims that he was raped when he was an adolescent at a restaurant where he worked.
Berdella never reported the incident to the police. In 1967, after graduating high school, Berdella enrolled in Kansas City Art Institute. At this time, he'd begun exploring his sexuality.
He'd realised that he was certainly gay, and it was pretty apparent to him that his father would not have approved of that.
He's also been brought up in the Catholic Church, so I think there is very much an underlying sense of shame there.
By 1969, Berdella had begun to experiment with drugs. He quit college after tutors failed to understand his twisted art projects, often involving live animals.
He may have been a bit nerdy to look at, and a bit strange, but he was clearly talented.
In need of a job, Berdella put his talents to a new use.
Berdella started working as a short order chef and quickly rose.
He developed quite a good reputation in the local community as people were talking about the food that he was making. And he bought his own house. He had quite a bright future. He really was a figure that commanded respect in the local community.
By his mid to late 20s, Berdella had also developed a passion for collecting, and this hobby soon became a business in its own right.
He was obviously a very good chef, but it wasn't his only talent. He also collected art and antiquities, This was a man of quite considerable taste, working at some of the best restaurants and at the same time operating a boutique called Bob's Bazaar, selling art and antiquities.
The boutique became Berdella's full-time job, and he began to rent out rooms in his home to help make ends meet. Some of those lodgers were vulnerable young men who'd receive bed and board in return for carrying out jobs around the house and at his antique shop.
People who'd run away from home, young gay men, couples, rather a sort of benevolent figure.
Berdella had developed a sick taste for torture and murder, and after getting away with his first crime, he began to look for ever-increasing, horrific ways to get his sexual kicks. 9 months after he tortured and murdered his first victim, 19-year-old Jerry Howell, Robert Berdella took his next victim.
So Robert Sheldon was somebody who had stayed with Berdella before at his house. So there was a degree of trust in this relationship, and it was trust that Berdella really did take advantage of.
On April the 10th, 20-year-old drug addict Robert Sheldon appeared at Berdella's door looking for somewhere to stay after an argument with his girlfriend. Shortly after he set foot inside, Berdella put his sadistic plan into action.
He keeps him for 4 days. Automatically, you know that this is going to be somebody who's in distress. He starts to escalate his cruelty with this victim. He injects drain cleaner into his eyes. He fills his ears with caulking material. There's damage to the hands from piano wire. He's hitting him with a rubber mallet. All of these things are acts of cruelty, and they would not kill you. It's subduing the victim.
He did some horrendous things to him, but the thing that really stood out for me was the tattoo that he gave this victim on his shoulder. He was almost branding this man, saying, "You are mine, I own you and I possess you."
Like he had with his first victim, Berdella documented his methods by writing intricate notes. This time he went one step further and included himself in the photographs with his tormented victim.
He wanted an absolute record of everything he'd done. It was a certain amount of pride. There is no doubt whatever that that's what was in his mind. He documented it because he was proud of it.
On the 14th of April, Berdella arrived home to find a workman he knew on the roof of his property. Concerned that he'd be discovered, he decided to kill Robert.
He becomes quite paranoid because he knows this guy. So Berdella takes matters into his own hands and he goes and places a plastic bag over the head of his victim, essentially ending his life.
Berdella began his ritual act of cutting up his victim's body piece by piece.
Dismembering a body is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but if you have some knowledge, like a surgeon or a chef, then you can quite effectively dismember a body, and that makes it easier to dispose of.
This horrific expertise in chopping up bodies later earned Berdella the nickname the Kansas City Butcher. In keeping with his obsession with collecting, this time Berdella decided he wanted to keep a souvenir of his actions.
Berdella's second victim, Robert, he dismembered the body and cut off the head. But this time he didn't put it all into black garbage bags and put it out for the garbage truck. He kept the head first in the freezer in his house, and he later buried it in the garden where it decomposed as a kind of trophy of the killing.
And this is really significant for me because the head is what gives somebody their identity. It's what makes them a human. I think by keeping the head, Berdella wants to be able to say, I'm the one that has depersonalized this individual. I'm the one that's dehumanized them.
Berdella had now tortured and murdered 2 people without being caught. On March the 29th, 1988, he picked up 22-year-old male prostitute Christopher Bryson and took him back to his house.
So Christopher Bryson was wandering the streets when Robert Berdella picks him up. and he offers him a beer, and they drive around in his car for a while. Berdella then says, well, come back to my house and you can have a beer there. So Christopher agrees and they go back.
He was brought home to provide sexual favors for Berdella and was told to go upstairs as soon as they got there. As Bryson mounted the stairs and started walking up, he was struck from behind and rendered unconscious.
With his victim sedated and held captive, Berdella began his deadly ritual.
Once again, he is tortured, he is assaulted, he is given bleach in the eyes, but this time it's swabbed onto the eyeballs rather than injected in. That would probably be even more painful. There are many nerve endings on the globe of the eye which would react very badly to the bleach.
Repeatedly electrocuted, raped and injected with a cocktail of sedatives, Christopher remained a submissive captive for 4 days. But on the morning of April the 2nd, 1988, when Berdella had left for work, Christopher managed to set himself free.
He finds some matches and he's able to actually burn through the robes that Berdella had restrained him with. So he flees the house wearing only a dog collar.
He must have been an extraordinary sight, a naked man wearing a dog collar. He runs across the street, meets a meter reader who's going to a house. They knock on the door. The house owner is astonished, opens the door astonished, won't let Christopher into the house, but does call the police.
Roy Orth was a sergeant with the Kansas City Police Department when they received the call.
Chris had been severely physically abused and was asking for help. District officers got there, found this was probably going to be some kind of an unlawful restraint, abduction situation, and called the Sex Crimes Child Abuse Unit, and our detective responded.
Rick Holtzclaw was the assistant prosecutor for the Sex Crimes Unit in Kansas City.
Roy Orth called me and said, "We need you." And I said, "You don't need me today." And he said, "No, I'm telling you, we need you on this one." He may have told me briefly what it was. We had someone who had escaped naked with a dog collar. It became evident that they were going to need some assistance, so I went to the home on that Saturday afternoon, and we began the investigation, getting search warrants, and that's how it began.
In just over a 3-year period, Berdella had held, brutally raped, tortured and killed 6 men and got away with it. Unknown to the police, they were about to uncover the shocking crimes committed by a sadistic serial killer, Robert Berdella. Troy Cole was the lead detective in charge of the case.
I first became aware of him April 2nd, 1988. I was working in the homicide unit. It was a Saturday, and was called out in regards to a sodomy. The guy alleged that he had been kidnapped and held captive for a number of days, and I was the duty sergeant, which meant that I handled the homicides, the robbery, and the sex crimes for that particular day. Christopher managed to escape and flag down a passerby. That's what brought us to the residence.
The traumatized victim recounted his ordeal and gave police the name and address of his captor. When Berdella arrived home that evening, the police were waiting for him. Huntley was born in Grimsby in Lincolnshire on the 31st of January 1974. He had a turbulent time at school and was often the target of bullying.
So I think this created a bit of a sense of shame in Ian Huntley, something that is often at the root of a lot of men like him in terms of what they go on to do. So he started off as somebody who was always the kid that was a bit odd, the odd one out, the one who's a bit of a loner.
In December 1994, Huntley met 18-year-old Claire Evans. They had a whirlwind romance and were married within weeks.
His wife, Claire, quickly found that he had a terrible temper. She later claimed that she feared for her life and that he would often put his hands round her neck.
Ian Huntley is somebody who is not capable of having a normal relationship with a woman. So he moves very quickly because he wants to maintain a sense of control within his relationships. So he will breeze into women's lives, this knight in shining armour, full of charm and compliments, and will kind of try and wind them in.
Huntley's marriage didn't last long. His wife Claire had started a relationship with his younger brother Wayne. Despite the marriage being all but over, Huntley refused to grant her a divorce until 1999 to prevent their relationship from becoming official.
He'd always felt incredibly threatened by his younger brother. He took the attention away from him when he came into that family. And because of Ian Huntley's narcissistic tendencies, he's always going to feel he's being outdone by his brother.
While still married to Claire, Huntley fathered a daughter with a 15-year-old girl in 1998.
I think it would be fair to say that Huntley demonstrated throughout his adolescence and early manhood that he had an unhealthy appetite in younger and younger women.
Well, during his 20s, Ian Huntley preyed on a lot of young girls, underage girls, and the police who investigated the case thought that there were possibly up to 60 young girls that he'd had some kind of interaction with on that level. And he would kind of worm his way into these girls' lives. And they're younger, they're more impressionable, they're easier to lure in.
In 1998, 24-year-old Huntley appeared at Grimsby Crown Court, charged with both burglary and the rape of an 18-year-old girl. Both cases were dropped due to lack of evidence, but he was gaining a bad reputation across Lincolnshire.
He was insignificant little man who, on the surface, wouldn't say boo to a goose. Unfortunately, he had no conscience and would do whatever he wanted when he wanted to do it.
In February 1999, Huntley met 22-year-old Maxine Carr, and after dating for just 4 weeks, they moved in together.
She was naive, impressionable, and he was an interesting figure to her, I think. She found him, perhaps, I would hesitate to call him charismatic, but at least interesting, and did not discover the violent side to his nature that his wife had.
Maxine Carr was a very easy target, in a way, for Ian Huntley, because at this point in his life, he's managed to hone those skills of hooking women in, being quite superficially charming and manipulative, and saying the things that they wanted to hear. So he's got quite a well-rehearsed script at this point in time.
On the 15th of August, 11 days after the girls went missing, Sky News decided to retrace their steps, which meant interviewing the last person to see them, local school caretaker Ian Huntley, the boyfriend of Holly and Jessica's classroom assistant, Maxine Carr.
It's 6:15 p.m. The timeline on that Sunday night, the 4th of August, puts the girls here, right in the forecourt of the village college, the local education centre. We know they'd been to the sports centre just across the road a few minutes before to buy some sweets and were carrying on walking through what would have been very familiar territory. Their primary school, St Andrews, is just across the back of the village college here. How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
I don't know the girls. I was stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just said, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Huntley looked like an unassuming, ordinary little bloke with a soft voice who wouldn't hurt a fly.
He was a slight withdrawn sort of character, but at the time he seemed reasonably credible. It seemed like a credible story. That's where the girls would have walked. So when I talked to him, I had an open mind. I certainly at the time wasn't thinking, this is the guy that's done them harm.
Maxine Carr was also keen to appear on camera.
We interviewed her in the middle of the village and got her to tell us about her relationship with the girls.
They're ever so funny, they're brilliant, they're kind to everybody. They wouldn't say a bad word about anybody. And they love their families and everything, which is why nobody believes that they would ever run away. They was very close to all their family. This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very upset, and that's the kind of girl she was. She was just lovely, really lovely.
In the conversation, we realised a few minutes afterwards, she spoke about the girls in the past tense. When I was talking to her live, didn't really occur to me, but a couple of minutes afterwards we said thanks very much and she walked off, and my producer said, just play that tape again. I'm sure she was talking about the girls in the past tense.
Often the perpetrator is among the searchers, not without exception, but often, because they want to admire their own handiwork.
Could it be the person responsible for Holly and Jessica's disappearance had been under the noses of detectives from day one? On the 16th of August 2002, 12 days after the disappearance of 10-year-old schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, local caretaker Ian Huntley and his girlfriend Maxine Carr had been taken in for questioning by police. Interviews given by the pair on Sky News had roused the suspicions of detectives.
We were starting to think, wow, these two people really could be involved in something to do with these girls. They're close enough to it. They've clearly aroused police suspicion at this stage.
But after just 7 hours, they were released when Carr provided Huntley with an alibi. She claimed she was with him in their home on the night of the girls' disappearance.
It wasn't until about 10 or 11 at night that we heard that police released them, which we found interesting, and I got a phone number from Maxine Carr. I thought, well, worth a gamble, I'll just ring and see if I get through to them. And extraordinarily enough, I did. I got straight through to Maxine Carr. And I said, I gather you've been interviewed by the police. What happened? How are you? She said, well, we're fine. I can't tell you anything about it, but it's all right. Huntley then grabbed the phone off her and I guess wanted to end the conversation quickly. So he said, well, thanks for ringing. Yeah, we're fine. Nothing to report. The police have let us go. Nothing going on. Thanks a lot. Thanks for ringing. Bye.
Once Huntley and Carr had been questioned, further searches were carried out at their home and at Huntley's place of work, Soham Village College.
It was quite clear as we checked back that something had happened on the Friday night during the interviews with Huntley and Carr. It had triggered further searches, and because they suddenly saw Huntley as perhaps the key figure here, they went back over his territory, his home, and his workplace. And it was then that they began to find evidence that he had abducted the girls.
On the 17th of August, investigators got their biggest breakthrough in the case yet. In the bins at the school where Huntley worked, they found the burnt remains of 2 football shirts, tracksuit bottoms, shoes, and some underwear. Forensic expert Peter Lamb identified the clothes as those belonging to Holly and Jessica.
One of the crucial items in this particular case was the tops that the little girls were last seen in. These were unusual, and this helped us tremendously to build up a picture of the types of fibres that it would be easy for us to find.
Whenever two human beings interact, there is an exchange of material, be that something as tiny as DNA, up to something less subtle like a fibre, up to saliva or bodily fluids, blood. We leave a mark on each other, and no matter how hard one tries to destroy all of that evidence, there will usually be something left to say that two people have been interacting. There is this constant interaction of material that allows forensic scientists to draw conclusions and ultimately to come up with very strong evidence that places one person in one place with another person and builds the case.
Forensic scientist Peter Lamb had the girls' clothes, but now he had to link them forensically to Ian Huntley. And it didn't take long.
During the examination of the items from the bin, I found 5 human head hairs. These head hairs were compared with Holly's hair and Jessica's hair. They didn't match either of those two, but they did match Ian Huntley's hair.
This vital evidence led to the arrest of both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr on the very same day, the 17th of August, on suspicion of abduction and murder.